Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Was it amazing or just okay? Drop a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. The first thing I did when we arrived at the villa was throw open the curtains and let the Mediterranean light pour in. The room felt warm, golden, like the kind of place you'd dream of but never expect to actually stand in. Outside, the cliffs of Positano tumbled down to the sea, and the water stretched so far it seemed unreal, an oil painting come to life. I pressed my forehead against the glass, breathing it in. This is exactly what we needed. Behind me, Daniel groaned, already dropping his bags by the bed. 1,000 photos incoming. You know me too well. I had spent months planning this tripevery detail, down to the exact cafes I wanted to visit and the hidden gem restaurants that didn't show up in basic Google searches. It was our first real vacation, a break from our tiny, cluttered apartment and the dull hum of daily life. Daniel stretched out on the bed, sighing dramatically. Nap first, then food. Walk first, I corrected. Just a short one, just to get a feel for the town. He grumbled but followed me out anyway. Positano felt alive in a way our city never did. Its streets tangled and winding, full of tiny staircases that led to nowhere, bursts of bougainvillea climbing up old stone walls. I stopped every few minutes to take a photo of a fisherman mending his net, of an old woman peeling oranges on a doorstep, of market stalls spilling over with bright woven fabrics and ceramic plates. Daniel had long since given up on hurrying me along. He stood at my side as I framed a shot of the town square, waiting while I adjusted the focus. Click. I barely noticed the man in the background. That night we ate by the water under glowing string lights, the kind of meal that felt endless, filled with laughter and slow sips of wine. By the time we walked back to the villa, I was lightheaded and happy, Daniel's hand warm in mine. The next few days blurred into a routine morning spent lingering over cappuccinos, afternoons hiking to old ruins or swimming in the bluest water I had ever seen. Every night, I sat cross-legged on the bed, combing through the day's photos, adjusting the contrast, playing with the light. And then, on the third night, I saw him. At first, I didn't even register it. I was scrolling through the shots absent-mindedly when something in the background caught my eye. In the middle of the market square, behind the crowd, stood a man. Not strange on its own. The town was filled with tourists. But then I found him again. In another photo, taken from the cliffs above, he was at the edge of the frame, just slightly out of focus, the same dark jacket, the same odd posture. Again, near the marina, standing just behind a group of people waiting for a boat. Again, near the cathedral steps, his face turned just enough that I couldn't make out the details. A chill crawled up my spine. "Everything okay?" Daniel's voice made me jump. I hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. This guy keeps showing up in my photos. Daniel leaned in, barely paying attention. Maybe he's part of a tour group, same itinerary as us. I frowned. Maybe. But something felt wrong. The next morning, I started paying attention. At breakfast, I studied every face in the cafe. When we hiked up to an old watchtower, I scanned the crowd, searching, but I never saw him. By the time we boarded the ferry to Capri, I had almost convinced myself I was overreacting. And then I saw him again. I wasn't even looking for him this time. I had been taking a picture of the waves crashing against the side of the boat when I spotted him on the lower deck, standing near the railing. My stomach twisted. He was facing me this time. I grabbed Daniel's sleeve, my voice low. "He's here." Daniel followed my gaze. "Who?" "The guy," I said, fumbling to zoom in on my camera screen. "Look." He squinted at the photo, then at the deck below. No one was there. Soph, you're freaking yourself out. I shook my head. He was just there. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple. Maybe you just saw someone who looked like him. But I knew. That night, after another dinner where I barely tasted the food, I uploaded the photos to my laptop. I needed a clearer look. I adjusted the lighting, sharpened the image. And then I noticed something that made my breath catch. The photos weren't just from this trip. I scrolled further back, a month ago at the lake. There, a shadowed figure near the water's edge. Further back, a friend's wedding. In the background, standing too still. Further, Christmas. At the edge of a crowded party, turned away, just enough that his face wasn't visible. A cold sweat prickled along my skin. Daniel wandered in from the bathroom, towel slung over his shoulders. You're still on that? I turned the laptop toward him, my hands shaking. He frowned, leaning in. Wait, is that from before we even left? I nodded, my throat dry. The room felt too quiet, too still. Daniel swallowed. His voice came out lower this time. Okay. A long pause. That's not normal. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the balcony doors. I never slept that night. Not in the way people say when they toss and turn, drifting in and out. I mean, I didn't sleep. At all. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind conjured him standing in the doorway, just beyond the curtain, or worse, at the foot of the bed, watching. I kept the laptop open on my nightstand, the photos still glowing on the screen. Maybe I thought that if I stared at them long enough, I'd figure it out. Maybe there was a logical explanation. A trick of the light, some strange coincidence, something I could explain away in the morning. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. It wasn't a coincidence. He was there, always there. Not just in the background, not just some passing stranger. In every photo, no matter the setting, no matter the time, he was always positioned the same way, just slightly apart from the crowd, just outside the natural flow of things. Like an afterthought, an anomaly. And the worst part? His face was never clear. It wasn't pixelation, it wasn't motion blur, it was deliberate. Every single time something obscured him, his head turned at the last second, the brim of a hat, a shadow falling perfectly across his features. I felt sick. Daniel had fallen asleep hours ago, his arm draped lazily across my waist, his breathing steady. I envied how easily he could shut things out, how quickly he had dismissed it as nothing. I slid out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him. My chest was tight, an anxious energy pressing against my ribs. I needed air. The villa had a small balcony that overlooked the cliffs, and I stepped onto it, wrapping my arms around myself. The night air was thick with salt and the distant hum of the sea. The town below was mostly quiet now, the last remnants of the evening settling into silence. I let out a slow breath, staring at the darkened streets. Maybe I was spiraling. Maybe I had let my paranoia get the best of me. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the square, half hidden in the shadows. I froze. My pulse slammed against my throat, a sharp, visceral panic overtaking me. He wasn't moving. He wasn't walking like the other late-night wanderers. He was just standing there, watching. The distance between us was enough that I couldn't make out his face, but I didn't need to. I knew. I backed away from the balcony railing, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Get inside now. I stumbled back into the room, locking the balcony door behind me. Daniel stirred at the sound. Soph, his voice was thick with sleep. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. I climbed back into bed, my back to him, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child. Maybe if I ignored it, if I just shut my eyes and forced myself into sleep, it would be gone by morning. Maybe. The next day, I didn't say anything. Not at breakfast, not during our hike along the coastal path, not even when Daniel wrapped an arm around my shoulders and told me I seemed quiet. I wasn't quiet. I was listening, watching, scanning every crowd, every passing face. I didn't see him, not once. By the time evening rolled around, I almost believed I had imagined it. Maybe I was sleep-deprived, caught in some loop of paranoia. I convinced myself I had mistaken another person for him, that I had let my mind warp a random traveler into something sinister. We had planned dinner at a small restaurant tucked into the cliffs, a place I had read about months before. The kind of spot where the tables were carved from stone, the wine poured without asking, the waiters treating every guest like a lifelong friend. Daniel was already relaxed again, stretching out in his chair as the waiter refilled his glass. "You feeling better?" he asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah, I think I just needed a good day." The words were barely out of my mouth when I heard the shutter. A camera. Click. A soft, unmistakable sound. I stiffened, my blood running cold. Daniel didn't seem to notice, still glancing at the menu, but I felt it someone taking a picture. Slowly, I turned my head. At the far end of the restaurant, just past the flickering glow of the candlelit tables, he was sitting. I went completely still. For the first time I could see him properly. No shadows, no blur. He was older than I had imagined, mid-50s maybe, with thinning hair and a face so completely unremarkable it sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I had expected something monstrous, something that fit the slow-building horror in my gut, but he looked normal. And that made it so much worse. Because it meant he wasn't some ghostly anomaly, some supernatural trick of the light. He was real, and he was still taking photos. The camera sat on the table in front of him, his hands resting casually on either side of it. He wasn't holding it up to his face, wasn't even trying to be discreet. He just sat there, staring directly at me. Click. I shot up so fast my chair scraped against the stone. Daniel blinked. "What the hell?" "We have to go." My voice was unsteady. Daniel followed my gaze, then frowned. "Who's that?" I grabbed his wrist, trying to pull him up. "I don't know, just let's go." Daniel hesitated, but something in my expression must have convinced him because he dropped some cash on the table without question. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder as we wove through the maze of streets back toward the villa. I half expected him to be following us, to turn a corner and see him standing there. But he wasn't. When we finally reached the villa, I locked the door behind us, my hands trembling. Daniel was watching me now, his brow furrowed. "Sophia, what the hell is going on?" I shook my head. "It's him. He was there, at the restaurant, taking photos of me." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, that's weird, yeah. But maybe he's just a creep. Some old guy who..." "It's not just that." My voice cracked. "He's in all our photos, Daniel, before we even got here, before we even left. I don't know how, but he's in them." Daniel looked skeptical, but then I saw at that flicker of doubt, of unease. I turned toward my bag, grabbing the camera. "I can show you. I'll show you everything." But when I flipped the camera on, my stomach dropped. The photos were gone. Every single one. The screen flashed. "No files found." I felt like I was sinking. No, they were here. Daniel was at my side now, staring at the screen. "What do you mean gone?" I frantically scrolled, searching, knowing they had been there just hours ago, but there was nothing. Like they had never existed. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Okay, this is getting fucking weird." I gripped the camera tighter, my pulse pounding. Someone had erased them, and I had a feeling it wasn't me. The next morning I woke with the unmistakable sense that something had shifted, a wrongness that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Daniel was still asleep, his arms sprawled over the empty space where I had been lying, his breathing deep and steady. I envied him for that. For the ability to shut everything out, to exist in the kind of deep unconsciousness that didn't allow for fear or second guessing. I rolled over and grabbed my camera off the nightstand, my fingers tight around the body of it. The images were gone, I knew that. But some desperate part of me kept hoping it had been a mistake, a glitch. Maybe if I turned it on now, they'd all be there, untouched, like nothing had happened. I clicked the power button. The screen blinked to life. No files found. My stomach clenched. It didn't make sense. Cameras didn't just erase themselves. I shoved the camera back into my bag and slid out of bed, careful not to wake Daniel. The sun had barely begun to rise, its weak gold light spilling through the cracks in the shutters, making the room feel eerily soft, almost fragile. The villa was silent, save for the occasional shift of wood settling in the walls, the distant hush of the sea below. I stepped onto the balcony, gripping the cool iron railing, and scanned the streets below. Empty. But I knew better than to believe I was alone. Somewhere he was watching. I just didn't know where. The thought made my skin crawl. I turned back inside and grabbed my laptop from the table, opening it with the urgency of someone grasping at the last thread of logic. The camera files were gone, but maybe they were still on the memory card. I plugged it into the laptop, heartbeat thick in my ears. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared. I clicked it open. Inside was only one file. A video. My hands went cold. I hadn't recorded any videos. I hesitated, then hit play. The screen flickered, static swallowing the first few seconds. Then darkness. A deep, inky black, as if the camera had been left recording inside a room with no light. A low sound filtered through, breathing. Not mine. Not Daniel's. Something else, slow, deliberate. I felt a sharp pulse of nausea, but I forced myself to keep watching. The screen remained dark for what felt like forever, and then, without warning, the image shifted. A hotel hallway, dimly lit. The angle was tilted, like the camera had been held at someone's side. The carpet was a faded red, the kind that soaked up years of footsteps, of voices, of weight pressing down. The hallway stretched forward, empty except for a single figure. Me. My breath locked in my throat. It was me standing outside the villa door, fumbling for the key. The timestamp in the corner was from last night. I felt like I was sinking. This wasn't a recording I had taken. Someone had filmed me. A slow dread bled into my limbs as I watched myself on screen, unaware, completely vulnerable. The way I shifted my bag, tucked my hair behind my ear, oblivious to the fact that someone was behind me. Close enough to record me, close enough to reach out, and the video cut to static. The screen went black again, but the audio remained, that slow, deliberate breathing. And then, just before the file ended, a whisper. My name. I slammed the laptop shut so hard it nearly toppled off the table. The room spun. I clutched the edge of the chair, trying to steady myself, but my skin felt electric with terror, my pulse erratic. This is real. This is happening. I turned toward the bed. My voice caught somewhere between a whisper and a shout. Daniel. He stirred, groaning as he pushed himself upright. What's? His eyes narrowed at my expression. Jesus, Soph, you look like you've seen a ghost. I shook my head, still gripping the laptop like it might disappear. The photos are gone, but there's a video. Daniel rubbed his eyes. What video? I swallowed, pushing the laptop toward him. It's not mine. Someone took it. Someone filmed me outside the villa last night. That woke him up fast. He frowned, his movements sharper now as he opened the laptop again. I watched his face as he played the video, his usual easy confidence shifting into something stiffer, something unreadable. By the time it ended, his jaw was tight. Okay, he exhaled, shutting the screen. That's not normal. No shit. I realized my hands were shaking. I clenched them into fists, willing the feeling away. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the small space between the bed and the table. His mind worked differently than mine. He didn't jump straight to horror. He jumped to fixing things. First thing we're checking out. Today, we'll go somewhere else. Somewhere busier, somewhere less. He gestured vaguely at the villa. It made sense. It was also exactly what he would expect us to do. I wrapped my arms around myself. And then what? Then we go to the police. We show them this. He motioned toward the laptop. They can track where the video came from. Maybe they can find this guy. I wanted to believe it would be that simple. Daniel grabbed his phone, scrolling quickly. I'll book a new hotel, somewhere further inland. We'll... A loud knock echoed from the door. We both went rigid. The air between us stretched, tight and fragile. The knock came again, slow, measured. Not the hurried, distracted knock of hotel staff. Not the impatient rap of a guest at the wrong door. A knock meant to be heard. I moved first, grabbing Daniel's arm. My voice was barely above a whisper. Don't open it. Daniel hesitated. What if it's... Knock. This time it was softer. Like whoever was on the other side knew we were right there. Like they were waiting. I reached for my phone, heart hammering. We should call the front desk, call someone. But before I could, a small rustling sound made me freeze. Something slipping under the door. A piece of paper. Daniel stared at it. So did I. Neither of us moved. Finally, he bent down, picking it up with cautious fingers. He turned it over, his brow furrowing. There were only 4 words. Words that made my breath catch, my stomach drop, my entire body turn cold. You can't delete me. Daniel and I stared at the note as if expecting it to change, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something harmless, something that didn't send ice curling through my veins. You can't delete me. The paper itself was ordinary hotel stationery, the kind you found in every drawer of every rented room. But the handwriting was sharp, deliberate, not rushed, not messy, calm. I pressed my palm against my forehead, willing myself to stay steady. This isn't just some random guy following us, Daniel. This is... I struggled for the right word, for something that could encompass the sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip on the note tightening. His face was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles had gone rigid. Okay, he said, we leave, right now. I didn't argue. We packed in silence, moving quickly, stuffing clothes into our bags with none of the usual care. It was messy, frantic, but I didn't care. I just needed to be out of that villa, out of that room. Daniel called a car while I threw the last of my things into my backpack. I booked a place in Sorrento. Busy area, lots of people. We'll be safer there. Safer. The word felt thin, weak. I wasn't sure anywhere felt safe anymore. 15 minutes later, we were in the back of a taxi, speeding away from the cliffs of Positano. The villa disappeared behind the winding roads, swallowed by the rising morning mist. I should have felt relief. I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving didn't matter. That distance wasn't the solution. That he, whoever he was already ahead of us. Daniel rested a hand on my knee. We'll go straight to the police once we check in. We'll show them the note, the video. My stomach twisted. The video. I yanked my bag into my lap, unzipping the side pocket where I had stashed my laptop. I flipped it open, my fingers moving too fast, my pulse hammering as I pulled up the files. Empty. Not just the video, everything. Every document, every photo, every piece of data wiped clean. I let out a small, breathless sound, part disbelief, part sheer terror. Daniel leaned in. What is it? I turned the screen toward him. It's gone. It's all gone. His expression darkened. He pulled out his phone. Then we'll show them the message, the handwriting. It's enough to file a report. He stopped. I watched his face shift, the slight furrow in his brow. He turned his phone toward me. All his photos were gone too. Not just from the trip, everything. Every saved image, every screenshot, every video wiped as if they had never existed. My throat went dry. "We've been hacked," Daniel said, but his voice was thinner now, less certain. It didn't feel like hacking. It felt like something else. We pulled into Sorrento just after noon, the streets bustling with tourists. It should have comforted me being surrounded by so many people, but all I could think was any one of them could be him. Daniel checked us in while I hovered near the entrance, my fingers tight around the strap of my bag. The hotel was sleek, modern, too new for someone to slip around unnoticed. Cameras in the lobby, at the elevators. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Once we got to our room, Daniel locked the door behind us. He double-checked it, then closed the curtains before sitting on the bed, rubbing his face. "We need to go to the police," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "I know," he muttered. But neither of us moved. Because deep down, we both knew it wouldn't help. What could we even say? That a faceless man had been following us? That our files had vanished, our pictures erased? That he knew exactly where we were at all times? The police wouldn't take it seriously. It was too strange, too thin, too unreal. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on my ribs. I reached for Daniel's hand without thinking, gripping it tightly. He squeezed back, his thumb brushing against mine. "I think," I said slowly, "he wants us to be afraid." Daniel nodded, his gaze distant. "He's doing a damn good job of it." That night, neither of us slept. We kept the lights on, sat up in bed, taking turns glancing toward the door, toward the window. The fear was a living thing in the room with us, thick and suffocating. At some point, exhaustion took over. I don't remember closing my eyes, don't remember drifting off. But I remember waking up, because something was wrong. The room was dark, too dark. The bedside lamp that had been on all night was off, the glow from the hallway gone. Even the distant lights from the city outside seemed to have been swallowed. I reached for Daniel, but my hand met empty sheets. I sat up fast, my pulse slamming in my ears. "Daniel?" No answer. My hands fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained black. I pressed the power button, tried again. Nothing. I swung my legs over the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. The silence was wrong. Hotels were never completely quiet there. Were always distant voices, muffled footsteps, the hum of air conditioning. But now, nothing. I took a step toward the bathroom, my breath shallow. "Daniel?" Then a click. The bedside lamp flickered back to life. And Daniel was standing at the far side of the room, facing the wall. His back was to me, his posture unnaturally stiff. I swallowed hard. "Daniel?" He didn't move. I stepped closer, something twisting deep in my gut. "What are you?" Then I saw it. The camera. It was in his hands, raised to his face. The screen was on, casting a faint glow over his fingers. He was looking at something through the viewfinder. I moved closer, my pulse erratic. Then he spoke. But his voice wasn't right. It was distant, detached, not his. "He's in here with us." My stomach flipped. "What?" Daniel finally turned. And in his hands, on the camera screen, was a live feed of me, standing exactly where I was. But behind me, just over my shoulder, someone else, watching. I turned. The room was empty. The camera wasn't. I choked out a breath, but my body wouldn't move. I could see him, the figure, standing so close, just inches away. His face was still blurred, still wrong, like a distortion that shouldn't exist. Daniel dropped the camera. "We have to." The lights flickered. Then everything went black. The darkness swallowed the room completely, a thick and absolute void. Not just the absence of light, but something deeper, something suffocating. The kind of darkness that pressed against my skin, that filled the spaces between my ribs, that watched. I couldn't see Daniel, but I could feel his presence beside me. His breathing was uneven, sharp. My own breath came in shallow bursts, barely there. I reached for him. My fingers brushed his wrist, cold with sweat. Daniel. Before I could finish, the camera flickered back on. Not the lights, just the camera. The tiny screen glowed weakly on the floor where it had fallen. And it was still recording. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me not to grab Daniel and run, to leave everything behind and never look back. But I looked. The screen showed us. Daniel and me, standing exactly where we were, frozen, waiting. And behind us, closer, no whim. No blur, no shadow, no distortion. Just a man. A face I didn't recognize, but somehow, deep in my bones, I knew him. I had always known him. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even threatening. It was worse. It was expectant. As if this moment, this exact second, had been inevitable. As if everything had led us here. I felt something move behind me. Too close. I spun, but there was nothing, just the empty hotel room. But the air had changed. Heavy, stagnant, wrong. Daniel grabbed my hand. I barely registered it, my body rigid, locked in place. The camera started glitching, the image stuttering, warping. But the last thing I saw before the screen cut to black was his mouth. Moving. Forming silent words. I didn't need sound to understand them. "You found me." The hotel room lights blinked back on. I gasped, the sudden brightness searing my eyes. The silence was gone. In its place, the muffled sound of voices outside, the distant hum of traffic, the normal world, back in place. As if nothing had happened. As if nothing had ever been wrong. The camera was still on the floor. I bent down, slowly, feeling the tremor in my own fingers. The screen was blank, the files gone. Again. I turned to Daniel. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Did you?" My voice cracked. "Did you see it?" Daniel swallowed. He looked like he wanted to deny it, to brush it off, to fix it the way he always did. But he couldn't. Because he had seen it too. I didn't wait for an answer. I grabbed my bag, my hands moving on autopilot, shoving everything inside. Daniel followed my lead, zipping up his suitcase, his movements clipped and tight. We didn't speak. We left the hotel in under 10 minutes. We didn't check out. We didn't stop walking until we were at the station, surrounded by a sea of travelers, people with destinations, people who existed in a world where things made sense. We boarded the next train to Rome without a plan, without a second thought. It didn't matter where we went, as long as it was away. For hours we sat in silence, the rhythmic hum of the train tracks the only sound between us. Daniel held my hand, but neither of us spoke. What was there to say? That we had been followed? That someone or something had erased itself from our records, from our lives? That we had been watched by a presence that didn't obey the rules of logic, of time, of reality? Who would believe it? Hell, I barely believed it. All I knew was this. We weren't going back. Not to Sorrento, not to Positano, not to anywhere he had followed us. And we weren't looking at the photos. Not anymore. I still had my camera. I could have taken it out, checked it, searched for any last traces of evidence. But I didn't. Because I knew he would be there. He always was. And I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of looking again. So I left the camera in my bag. I let it sit there, untouched, until we returned home weeks later. And then, on a cold morning in our apartment, without hesitation, I threw it in the trash. Not because I thought it would stop him, but because I refused to keep looking. Because I refused to let him know that I still felt him. That some nights, even now, I wake up with the suffocating certainty that I'm being watched. That even in the safest places, I still feel it. That presence, just out of sight. Just beyond the edge of the frame. Waiting. The day the substitute teacher arrived, it rained so hard the windows rattled. Fourth grade was restless from the moment the bell rang, whispers bouncing off the walls, feet swinging beneath desks, pencils tapping. Rain always did that to kids. It made the air feel thick, the room too small, like energy had nowhere to go but out. When the classroom door finally opened, everyone went quiet. The woman who stepped inside was thin, too thin. Her black skirt clung to sharp angles, and her blouse was pressed so stiffly it barely moved when she did. Her hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. She didn't smile, didn't clear her throat, didn't introduce herself. Just walked to the front of the room and started writing on the board. Her handwriting was too perfect. No hesitation, no uneven strokes, just smooth, mechanical letters forming two words. Miss Lyle. No good morning, class. No explanation of where Mrs. Collins had gone. Nothing. The silence stretched. A few students glanced at each other, uncertain. Kids could always sense when something wasn't right, even if they couldn't put it into words. I sat at the second to last desk in the row by the window, my backpack still hanging open, forgotten. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't her. I had been in this school since kindergarten, and in all those years, substitute teachers had fit into two categories. Overly enthusiastic, trying too hard to win us over. Checked out, barely doing the job. Miss Lyle was neither. She was empty. I had been staring, and when she turned around, my breath hitched, because she was staring directly at me. Her eyes were the wrong color. Not brown, not blue, not green, just gray flat and dull, like old film. The kind of gray that made you think of broken things. I swallowed and looked down at my desk. When I glanced back up, she had already turned away, moving with precise, measured steps toward the teacher's desk. Her shoes didn't make a sound. She picked up the attendance sheet but didn't call names. She just stood there looking at it, her lips slightly parted like she was reading silently to herself. The whole class sat stiffly in their seats, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. The rain hammered harder against the glass. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was wrong. It wasn't raspy or too deep or high-pitched. It was just off, flat, hollow, like the words weren't coming from her but from somewhere behind her. Take out your math books. No, please. No, let's begin. Just a command. Chairs scraped against the floor as we obeyed. I turned to the right page, but my hands felt cold, my stomach twisted in knots. She walked between the desks as we worked, passing so quietly I wouldn't have noticed her if I hadn't been watching. She didn't speak, didn't glance at the clock. Just moved. Up and down the aisles. And then I saw it. She never blinked. Not once. Not as she hovered over students, watching them write. Not as she circled the room, pausing behind chairs for a few long silent moments before moving on. The more I noticed, the harder it was to focus. I kept sneaking glances at her out of the corner of my eye. The way her movements were too precise. The way her hands never seemed to fully unclench. And the way she never touched anything. Not the desk, not the board, not the papers. Her hands hovered just above them, like she wasn't quite there. At lunch, the tension in the classroom finally broke. The moment the bell rang, kids bolted from their seats, a few whispering to each other as they disappeared into the hall. I stayed back. She didn't leave with the rest of us. Didn't say we were dismissed. She just stood at the teacher's desk, facing forward, staring. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I was the last one out. And just before I stepped into the hallway, I made the mistake of looking back. She was still watching me. Her gray eyes locked onto mine, unmoving. I turned and ran. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with low chatter, but something was off. Other kids had noticed. "She's weird," Mia whispered, glancing around as if Miss Lyle might be lurking nearby. "Did she even eat anything?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I stayed behind to grab my raincoat," she said. "She just sat there. No food, no drink, just sitting." Lucas leaned forward. "She didn't even use a computer. When Mrs. Collins is out, the subs always use the login on the teacher's desktop. But I walked past the room and nothing. The screen was black." We fell silent. "She doesn't blink," I muttered. Mia shuddered. "I thought it was just me." Lucas hesitated, then quietly, "I don't think she has a shadow." My skin went cold. I stared at him, waiting for him to say, "Just kidding," to smirk, to turn it into some weird joke. He didn't. I felt suddenly lightheaded, like my stomach had dropped without warning. Because he wasn't lying. I had noticed it tunely, I hadn't let myself believe it. The way she moved through the classroom, past the windows, past the light, past the places where shadows should have stretched. And yet, nothing followed her. I swallowed hard. We should tell someone. Lucas shook his head. "Who? The principal? What are we supposed to say? Hey, we think the sub isn't human." Mia stabbed her fork into her food. "Maybe she's just sick," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. I glanced across the cafeteria. At the far end, near the staff tables, a few teachers were talking and laughing over their lunches. They looked normal, real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew whatever Miss Lyle was, she wasn't one of them. A quiet, horrible thought crept into my mind, one that made my skin feel too tight, my throat dry. If she wasn't real, if she wasn't supposed to be here, then where was Mrs. Collins? The bell rang before anyone could say anything else. We stood, gathering our trays, and I hesitated. Something told me I shouldn't go back to class. That I should pretend to be sick, go to the nurse's office, anything but walk back into that room. But I didn't. Because deep down I already knew. I already knew that something was waiting for us. And we were about to find out what. The air in the classroom felt wrong when we walked back in. Not cold, not hot, just off, like the kind of stillness that came before a thunderstorm. The fluorescent lights hummed too loudly, flickering just slightly. But maybe that was my imagination. Or maybe it wasn't. Miss Lyle stood at the front of the room, facing the chalkboard, not writing, not adjusting papers, just standing there. Like she had been there the entire time, waiting. I hesitated by the door, gripping the strap of my backpack. The rest of the class shuffled past me, their voices lower than usual, their movements careful. I glanced at Mia. She avoided my gaze. Lucas did too. Because we all felt it. We knew something wasn't right. And yet we sat down anyway. Miss Lyle finally moved. Slow, deliberate, she turned toward us, her hands still pressed close to her sides. Those gray eyes, flat, emotionless, swept across the room, taking us in one by one. She didn't smile, didn't speak. And then she did something I still can't explain. She tilted her head. Not a normal tilt, not the kind people do when they're curious or confused. It was too slow, too exact, like a machine calculating something. Her neck shouldn't have bent that way. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was just as empty as before. "Continue working from page 73. Chairs creaked as kids pulled out their books. Pages turned, pencils scratched. Everyone was too afraid to do anything but obey. I flipped open my own textbook, but I wasn't reading. I was watching. She didn't sit at the teacher's desk. She just stood there, watching us. Watching me. I kept my eyes on my book, but I could feel it, that unblinking stare drilling into the side of my face. I tried to ignore it. I tried not to look. But I did. And the moment I glanced up, she moved. Not a normal movement. She didn't step, didn't shift. 1 second, she was at the front of the room. The next, she was behind me. I didn't hear her move. I didn't see it. But she was there, standing inches from my chair. My breath locked in my throat. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't. I stared straight ahead, fingers digging into the edge of my desk. Then, she leaned down, close enough that I felt the air change, the unnatural stillness around her. And in the smallest, quietest voice, she whispered my name, not out loud. Inside my head, I shot up from my chair so fast it scraped against the floor. The noise shattered the silence, and all eyes snapped toward me. Miss Lyle remained where she was, staring at me with that blank, unreadable face. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Her gaze stayed locked onto mine, and for the first time I saw it. A flicker of something beneath her skin. A ripple, like static on an old television screen, distorting her features for the briefest second before smoothing out again. I backed away, my breath uneven. Two need to go to the nurse. Miss Lyle didn't react. She didn't nod, didn't ask if I was okay. She just stared. And then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She said, "Hurry back." Not a command. A warning. I grabbed my things and ran. I didn't go to the nurse. I went straight to the office. The hallway felt impossibly long as I walked, my mind racing. My legs still felt shaky from whatever had happened back there, my stomach twisting itself into knots. The receptionist barely glanced up when I entered. "Something wrong?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Two need to talk to the principal." Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. "About what?" "The substitute, Miss Lyle." She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Who?" I swallowed. "The sub, the one covering for Mrs. Collins." A longer pause. Then she glanced at her computer screen, scrolled, checked something. A slow, uneasy expression crossed her face. "We don't have a Miss Lyle on record," she said. My heart stopped. I gripped the counter. "That's not possible. She's in my classroom right now." The receptionist's face paled. "Mrs. Collins never called out today." The words didn't make sense at first. I stood there, frozen, trying to make it make sense. I turned back toward the hallway. The door to my classroom was barely visible at the end of it. Everything inside me screamed to run. Instead, I whispered, "Then who is in my classroom?" The principal called security. I sat in the front office, hands gripping the chair beneath me, my mind spiraling. The hallways were too quiet. The rain outside had stopped. Everything felt suspended, like time was waiting to see what would happen next. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, the principal returned. Her face was blank, unreadable. There was no one in the classroom. I blinked. "What?" She sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly. The students were sitting quietly at their desks. No teacher present, no sign that one had ever been there. My pulse thundered. "That's not." I shook my head. "That's not possible." She was there. She was just there. A pause. Then, "Are you feeling all right?" I stared at her. Something wasn't right. The way she was looking at me, the way her fingers tapped against the desk too rhythmically. A horrible thought slithered into my mind. I turned toward the receptionist. She was watching me now. So was the janitor by the supply closet, the office aide by the window. Their eyes too still, too expectant. The air in the room shifted, and suddenly I knew. I wasn't supposed to ask questions. I wasn't supposed to notice. I wasn't supposed to see. Miss Lyle was gone, but something else was still here, watching, waiting. And now they knew that I knew. The office was too quiet. the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but watching. The principal sat across from me, her hands folded neatly on the desk. The receptionist had stopped typing, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard. Even the janitor, who had been mopping the same tile for the past 5 minutes, stood still. His eyes settled on me. Something was wrong, and I had made a mistake. I had noticed. The realization hit me so hard I nearly choked on it. My stomach clenched, my hands gripping the chair beneath me so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't supposed to notice that Miss Lyle had never blinked. I wasn't supposed to ask where Mrs. Collins was. I wasn't supposed to tell them, but I had. And now they were all staring. The principal smiled, but it was too polite, too controlled. "You seem a little disoriented," she said gently. "Maybe you should go lie down in the nurse's office for a while." Number. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I didn't, not yet. Because if I ran now, I wouldn't make it. I had to be careful. I forced myself to swallow the panic rising in my throat, forced myself to nod. Yeah, maybe I just need some air. Her smile didn't waver. She stood slowly, like she had all the time in the world. "I'll walk you there," she said. The janitor had stopped mopping completely. He was just standing there, staring at the floor like he was listening. I couldn't stay here. I had to get back to my classroom. The second the principal stepped toward me, I moved. Fast. I pushed back from the chair and bolted into the hallway before she could grab my arm. I heard her voice sharp, calling after me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The hallway stretched too long in front of me. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing softly. I felt like I was running in slow motion, like the air had thickened around me, trying to hold me in place. I turned the corner, my shoes skidding against the linoleum. My classroom door was open. I burst inside, breathless, expecting chaos, expecting the students to be gone, to see nothing but empty desks and silence. But no. They were still there, sitting at their desks just as I had left them. Except now, they weren't moving. Every single one of them sat perfectly still, not writing, not whispering, just waiting. My breath hitched. Then Mia turned her head toward me. Slow, too slow, like a puppet on invisible strings. My stomach dropped. Her lips parted, but her voice was flat, wrong. "The principal is looking for you." I took a step back. Lucas turned his head next, the exact same way. "You should go to the nurse's office," he said. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. I scanned the room, chest tightening. They weren't blinking. Not a single one of them. Then I saw the desk. Mrs. Collins' desk. For the first time, I noticed something was different. Her chair was pushed back, like someone had been there. But no one was. Or had been. A sickening realization churned in my stomach. Mrs. Collins hadn't called out. She had never left. And now I had no idea where she was. A sound echoed behind me, a soft click. The classroom door had shut. I spun around, and my chest nearly caved in on itself. Miss Lyle stood in front of it, blocking the exit. She hadn't been there a second ago, but now she was. Standing perfectly still, her arms at her sides, those lifeless gray eyes boring into me. The air in the room changed. Not colder, not warmer. Just different. Like the space itself had warped, like it was no longer part of the school, no longer part of anything. My skin crawled. I took a slow step backward. Where is Mrs. Collins? Miss Lyle tilted her head. That same unnatural tilt. The classroom groaned, not loudly, not like the building was shifting, but like the very air inside it had stretched. She took a step toward me. not walking, gliding, like her feet weren't touching the floor at all. I felt something in me snap. I ran. I dove past the desks, knocking over chairs, my pulse a roaring sound in my ears. I reached for the window, slammed it open. The world outside wasn't there. Just blackness. No playground, no parking lot, no sky. Nothing. I stumbled back, my breath ragged. The classroom wasn't real anymore. A whisper curled around my mind, soft as silk. You were never supposed to notice. I turned toward it. Miss Lyle's face rippled. For a brief moment, I saw something else beneath it. Something empty. Something that shouldn't exist. A shape without a shape. A presence that had been here long before me and would be here long after. And then, the door burst open. The spell shattered. Reality slammed back into place so fast it hurt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The classroom window showed the real world outside the playground, the sky, the teachers walking by. I gasped, my knees weak, collapsing to the floor. Mrs. Collins stood in the doorway. Real, tangible, alive. She frowned, stepping inside. What on earth? I turned back to the classroom, my head still spinning. The desks, the kids, all of them were normal. Lucas blinked at me, confused. Mia whispered something to the girl beside her. The chairs I had knocked over were upright again, like nothing had happened. Miss Lyle was gone. Vanished. Like she had never been there. Mrs. Collins knelt beside me, concern in her eyes. Are you all right? I couldn't speak, couldn't move, because I knew they wouldn't remember. Not the students, not the teachers. No one. It had erased itself. I sat there, gasping, my whole body trembling. Mrs. Collins helped me up, but I barely felt it. I turned toward the chalkboard. It was clean. No sign of anything, except at the very bottom, written in the faintest chalk. A message. Just for me. I will return when you forget. I never spoke about it. Not to my parents, not to my friends, not even to Lucas or Mia. Because I knew the truth. It was still there, waiting. For another student. For another day. For when someone else noticed. Because that's how it works. It waits. Until someone sees what they shouldn't. And then it plays the game all over again. The bus pulled away, leaving me stranded in front of a rundown convenience store, regretting every decision that led me here. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, stretching long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. The gas station wasn't much faded signage, rusted fuel pumps, and a flickering neon open sign barely clinging to life. I had landed this job out of necessity, not choice. My shift started at 5 p.m. and lasted until 1 a.m. Not ideal, but rent wasn't going to pay itself. My boyfriend had promised to pick me up most nights, but the idea of waiting alone in the dead of night still made me uneasy. I pushed open the glass door, triggering a tinny bell chime overhead. The inside smelled of stale air, expired snacks, and cheap cleaner. The shelves were cluttered with dusty candy bars, off-brand sodas, and overpriced motor oil. Behind the counter stood the angriest-looking man I had ever seen. He hunched over the register, scowling at the screen like he was one wrong beep away from smashing it to pieces. A crooked name tag on his shirt read, "Carl, Manager." I approached cautiously. "Hey, You're Aaron?" He barely glanced up. "Yeah." Carl grunted, jerking his thumb toward the back. "Lockers are behind the stockroom. Use Mason's." I hesitated. "I'm sharing?" "Nah, he's gone. Let's just say he was slow in the head, kept screwing up orders, mumbling nonsense all the time. We thought he was going to be a cheap hire. but he cost us more than he was worth. Useless. I clenched my jaw but nodded. All right. Before I could walk away, the bell jingled again. A man in a faded trucker cap and flannel jacket stepped inside, balancing two small packages. He turned toward me, offering a friendly smile. "You must be the new hire," he said in a light southern drawl. I returned the smile, relieved to see at least one decent person here. "Yeah, I just started." "Good to meet you." He set the packages down on the counter and extended a hand. "I'm Tim. Do deliveries here a few times a day, but most of the time it's just you and Carl." He glanced at the manager, then back at me, lowering his voice. "Bless your heart," he muttered with pity, then left. Carl ignored him completely. I forced a tight-lipped smile and headed to the back. The locker room was cramped and stale, barely more than a glorified storage closet. Two lockers sat against the wall labeled Tim and the other Mason. I pulled open Mason's locker, ready to toss my coat inside. And that's when I saw it. A small, battered notebook wedged into the back corner. Its cover was worn, edges curled, pages yellowed from use. I flipped through it absent-mindedly. Most of the pages were filled with doodle stick figures, swirling patterns, tiny animals. But the very first page was different. A grid, boxes and lines drawn with heavy strokes. It almost looked like a map. I squinted, recognizing the layout. It was the store. Each aisle was marked out in neat rows, the break room, the stock room, the locker room, all there. But there was something extra. An additional room, shaded in, attached to the locker room. I frowned. That wasn't right. The gas station had 3 back rooms. There wasn't a fourth. I glanced up, staring at the wall across from me. A filing cabinet stood against it, covered in old paperwork and stacked cardboard boxes. Curious, I nudged it forward. Just a solid wall. Then I heard footsteps. Approaching the locker room. I quickly shoved the cabinet back into place and turned as Carl stepped into the doorway. He leaned against the frame, eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "Your boyfriend's here," he muttered. I forced a nod. "Right, thanks." Carl didn't move as I walked past him. I could feel his gaze following me the entire way out. For the next week, something about that filing cabinet nagged at me. I never moved it again, but every time I walked into the locker room, my eyes drifted toward it. I told myself it was nothing, until I noticed something about Tim. Most days he brought deliveries straight to the stockroom. That made sense. But every few nights, he'd take large boxes into the locker room. He always came out empty-handed, and whenever I checked after he left, the packages were nowhere to be found. One evening, I saw him carrying another mystery box toward the back. "Hey, Tim," I called casually. He stopped mid-step, forcing a smile. "Evenin'. What's in the boxes?" His expression didn't falter, but I caught the slight shift in his stance. "Just extra inventory." He turned, taking the package toward the stockroom instead. But when I left that night, I saw him again. This time he was walking toward the locker room with the same box. That night, I moved the cabinet again. The wall wasn't just a wall. A faint square outline was carved into the floor. At one end of the square, a keyhole. My heart pounded as I pressed my foot against it. The square shifted. It wasn't just a marking. It was a trapdoor. Footsteps echoed from the store. I shoved the cabinet back into place. Carl stood near the register watching me. "Slow night?" His voice was flat. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah." His eyes lingered on me for too long. I turned back to the counter, forcing myself to act normal. A few days later, my boyfriend pulled up to take me home. As I climbed into the car, I saw Tim unloading a large package from his van. For some reason, I couldn't look away. Then I saw inside the van. Stacks of sealed boxes, a clipboard sitting on top. I stepped closer. Liver X10, heart X6, kidneys 212. The realization hit me like a freight train. Tim looked up. Our eyes met. His face twisted from surprise to pure, unfiltered rage. He dropped the package and sprinted toward me. I ran faster, jumped into the car. Drive, now. The police found the hidden basement beneath the locker room. Carl and Tim were arrested. The gas station was a front for organ trafficking. But the worst part? Mason, the disabled man who once worked here, he was arrested too. Not because he was innocent, because he had been caught stealing from their supply and eating them. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. Work had been suffocating, my phone never stopped buzzing, and I couldn't remember the last time I had an actual conversation that wasn't work-related. I needed space, just a few days away from my apartment, away from deadlines, away from people in general. The listing was exactly what I was looking for: a secluded guest house on the edge of a small town, tucked between a row of evergreens, promising peace, privacy, and the perfect weekend getaway. The photos showed a cozy one-bedroom cabin, all modern furnishings and soft, warm lighting. It looked clean, well-kept, and most importantly, had a perfect 5-star rating. The host, Daniel, had over 100 positive reviews. Guests described him as friendly but hands-off, the type who gave you your space but was always available if you needed anything. It sounded ideal. I booked it for 3 nights. I should have done more research. I arrived just after sunset on Friday. The drive had been longer than expected, winding roads through patches of dense forest. The last 30 minutes completely dark aside from my headlights cutting through the trees. The place was even more remote than I'd realized. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sky was deep indigo, the air cool against my skin. The house itself was exactly like the picture, so sleek. Modern guest house, tucked behind the main property. A row of porch lights cast a warm glow across the front steps, making the place look inviting. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, taking a deep breath of fresh, pine-scented air. For a moment I felt a sense of relief. No honking, no notifications, no city noise. Just quiet. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the front door, where a keypad lock blinked red. I checked my email for the entry code, typed it in, and heard the soft click of the deadbolt unlocking. Inside, the place was immaculate. The scent of clean linen and faint wood polish filled the air. The living room was small but thoughtfully decorated: a gray couch, a coffee table with a stack of books, a sleek flat screen mounted on the wall. The kitchenette had stainless steel appliances, spotless countertops, and a welcome note from Daniel sitting on the island. I picked up the card. "Welcome, make yourself at home. Let me know if you need anything." Simple, polite. No weird rules or excessive house instructions. I tossed my bag onto the couch and exhaled. This was exactly what I needed. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first thing that felt off was the smoke detector. It was directly above the bidon of those sleek, modern units, flush with the ceiling. But there was a tiny black dot in the center of it, barely noticeable unless you were lying down and looking straight up. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for one thing. It was angled, not straight down like most detectors. It was tilted slightly downward toward the bed. I sat up slowly, my stomach tightening. It was probably nothing. Maybe it was just a design choice. Maybe I was overthinking it. Still, something gnawed at me. I stood on the bed, reaching up to inspect it. My fingers brushed over the small black dot. It wasn't smooth like the rest of the device. It felt like glass. A lens. My chest tightened. Number it couldn't be. I climbed down and grabbed my phone, quickly Googling how to tell if a smoke detector is a hidden camera. The results sent a sharp chill through me. Most modern hidden cameras use infrared sensors, meaning they'll reflect light in a certain way. If you shine a flashlight at them, the lens will often glow or bounce light back at you. My hands felt clammy as I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the black dot. For a second, nothing happened. Then a faint glint. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard, my skin prickling. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the angle or the ceiling paint reflecting back at me. But something inside me wasn't convinced. I needed to be sure. I opened the camera on my phone and switched it to selfie mode. Then I held it up, angling it toward the smoke detector, looking at it through the screen. There it was, a tiny blinking red light. A camera. My stomach dropped. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't some internet rumor. This was real. I was being recorded. I dropped the phone onto the bed, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. How long had it been running? How many guests had stayed here without knowing? I felt exposed, violated. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, snapped a photo of the detector, and stormed out of the bedroom. My mind was racing, but I knew one thing: I was getting out of there. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I tried to steady my breathing. The deadbolt clicked, and I yanked the door open, stepping onto the porch. The cool night air hit my face, but it didn't calm me. I turned to my car and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out the details, just the outline of a tall man, half shrouded in darkness. I took a shaky step back. "Daniel?" My voice came out uneven, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned slow, deliberate, and walked into the trees. I stood there, my breath ragged, my body rigid with fear. I didn't wait. I bolted for the car, threw my bag into the passenger seat, and locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were trembling so badly I struggled to get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I sped out of that driveway so fast the tires kicked up gravel, my heart still hammering. I drove straight into town and parked outside a well-lit gas station. Only then did I realize I was still shaking. I reached for my phone, ready to call Airbnb support, ready to report what I had found. But when I opened the app, something made my stomach drop. The listing was gone, not just unavailable, completely erased. And Daniel? His account had been deleted. I had no idea who he really was, or where that footage had ended up. I sat in my car, parked outside a gas station, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers ached. The Airbnb listing was gone, vanished like it had never existed. And Daniel? Deleted. I stared at the screen, my breathing uneven. How? Just an hour ago, his account had over 100 glowing reviews. Now, it was as if he'd never been there at all. I forced myself to take a slow breath, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Airbnb removed the listing after multiple reports. Maybe Daniel shut it down himself, covering his tracks the moment he realized I'd figured it out. Either way, I had no way to contact him. But I wasn't letting this go. I opened the Airbnb app's customer support chat and started typing. I just stayed at a listing that had hidden cameras. The host's account is gone, but I need to report this. I sent the message and waited, my leg bouncing with anxious energy. The gas station parking lot was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights above casting a sterile glow on my windshield. A response popped up almost immediately. "Hello, thank you for reaching out. Can you provide the listing address and any photos or videos you took?" I quickly typed out the address and attached the picture of the smoke detector camera. Another message came. We take privacy violations very seriously. Our trust and safety team will investigate immediately. Did you notice any other concerning details about the property or host? I hesitated, then typed, I saw someone outside right before I left. I think it was the host. The reply was slower this time. Were you harmed or threatened in any way? I exhaled, rubbing my temple. Number, not physically, but something wasn't right. I typed, no, but it felt like he was watching me. There was another pause then. We strongly recommend filing a police report in your local jurisdiction. Please let us know if you need further assistance. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was all they could do. Airbnb wouldn't hunt this guy down, they'd just remove him from their platform and move on. I needed to take this to the police. The station was about 10 minutes away, a squat brick building that looked more like an office than a law enforcement facility. I parked, gripping the wheel tightly for a moment before stepping out. Inside, the air was cool, sterile. A tired-looking officer sat behind a thick glass window. I cleared my throat. Hi, I need to report something. The officer glanced up. What's the issue? I hesitated, suddenly feeling stupid. What was I even going to say? I found a camera in my Airbnb, then my host disappeared. It sounded crazy, but I couldn't just let it go. I took a breath. I stayed at an Airbnb tonight. I found a hidden camera in the bedroom. I left immediately, but when I tried to report it, the host's account had been deleted. The listing was erased too. I don't know who he really is, and I'm worried about where the footage might end up. The officer's expression shifted. He sat up straighter. A hidden camera? I nodded quickly. In the smoke detector facing the bed. He grabbed a notepad. Did you take photos? I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the picture and showing him. His eyes narrowed. That's not good. I felt a surge of relief. At least he was taking it seriously. Did you find any others? He asked. I hesitated. I didn't get the chance to check everywhere. Once I found that one, I panicked and left. The officer nodded, scribbling something down. You said the listing disappeared? Yeah. When I went back to check, it was completely gone. Same with the host's profile. The officer's brow furrowed. He tapped his pen against the desk, thinking, Do you remember the address? I nodded, quickly reciting it. He turned to his computer, typing. The glow from the monitor reflected off his glasses as he scanned the screen. Then his expression changed. His shoulders stiffened slightly, his eyes flicking back and forth as he read something. My stomach clenched. What? He glanced at me. How long ago did you book this place? A week ago. Why? Another pause. Then he exhaled, sitting back in his chair. That house doesn't belong to anyone named Daniel. A cold wave of unease crawled up my spine. What do you mean? He turned the monitor slightly, showing me the screen. The property was listed under a completely different name. Not Daniel. Someone else. Someone who hadn't owned it for over a year. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. Then who the hell did I just rent it from? The officer leaned forward. That's what we need to find out. The next few hours were a blur of questions, reports, and waiting. Another officer took me to a small interview room, where I went through everything: how I booked the listing, what I found, the man I saw outside. Then they asked a question I hadn't considered. Did you leave anything behind? I swallowed hard. Yeah, a few things. In my rush to get out, I hadn't even thought about it. My toiletries, a charger, some clothes in the bathroom. The officer's expression darkened. We need to send someone to check the house. A pit of dread formed in my stomach. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the station lobby when an officer walked in, a serious expression on his face. We checked the house, he said. I sat up. And? He hesitated, then said something that made my entire body go cold. It was empty. I blinked. What? No furniture, no bedding, no dishes, just empty. My mouth went dry. That wasn't possible. I had slept there. I had walked through the kitchen, touched the couch, unpacked my bag. And now? Nothing. Like I had imagined the whole thing. The officer crossed his arms. Either this guy cleared out in a matter of hours, or he never lived there at all. A sinking realization hit me. It was staged. The officer nodded grimly. That's what we think. I felt sick. I had stayed in a fake house, rented from a fake person, and the entire time I had been watched. My voice came out weak. Did you find any cameras? The officer sighed. We found mounts for them, but they were all gone. Every trace of surveillance, every hidden device wiped clean. Whatever footage had been taken of me was already out there. I had no idea where, or who was watching. I sat in the police station, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my mind spinning. The house was empty, stripped bare, like it had never been furnished in the first place, like I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I had slept in that bed, touched those countertops, stood under that hidden camera, and felt my stomach turn when I realized what it was. And now it was all gone. The officer in front of me, a man in his late 40s with a weary expression, folded his hands on the desk. I need you to be honest with me. I met his gaze, my pulse still hammering. I am. He nodded slightly. Tell me one more time, step by step. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, and went through it all again. The listing, the perfect reviews, the house that looked just like the photos, how I'd settled in, unpacked, and gone to bed thinking I was completely alone. Then the smoke detector, the black dot that wasn't supposed to be there, the reflection in my camera that gave it away, how I'd fled only to see him, the man standing at the edge of the driveway watching me. The officer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. We're going to run a search on Daniel. I frowned. His account was deleted. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. That doesn't mean he's gone. His partner, a younger officer with sharp eyes, spoke for the first time. Airbnb hosts need verified identities to list properties. Even if he deleted his account, we might be able to trace it. A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. But then, the older officer's voice dropped slightly. You said the house belonged to someone else, that the actual owner hadn't lived there in over a year. I nodded. He exchanged a look with his partner. Then he reached for a manila folder on the desk and slid it toward me. We pulled the records. That house has been vacant for a while. No official tenants. No one named Daniel ever owned it. I stared at the folder, my throat tightening. So, what does that mean? The officer's voice was flat. It means someone broke in, set up fake furniture, and ran an illegal Airbnb scam out of a house they didn't own. The words hit me like a punch. I shook my head. Viewed it looked real. It felt lived in. The younger officer leaned forward. That's the point. Staging a property isn't hard if you know what you're doing. Cheap rental furniture, a few decorations. It doesn't take much to make a place look legitimate. I felt sick. I had stayed in a house that didn't belong to anyone. I had booked a room in a place that was never supposed to be rented. The officer continued. We checked the walls, floors, outlets. There were mounts for at least 4 hidden cameras. 2 in the bedroom, 1 in the bathroom vent, 1 in the living room. But they were all removed before we got there. My stomach churned. I already knew what he was going to say next. That footage is out there somewhere. I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were white. Can you track him down? The younger officer ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. We're trying. If he used a stolen identity, it'll be harder. But if we find anything, we'll let you know. It didn't feel like enough. It wasn't enough. But what else could I do? For the next few days, I barely slept. I kept my phone on me at all times, refreshing the Airbnb app, checking my email for any updates. Nothing. I searched online, hoping to find something about other guests who had stayed there. No one had reported it. No Reddit threads, no news articles, just silence. Then, on the fourth day, I got an email. Airbnb support. Privacy violation case update. I opened it with shaking hands. The email was short, too short. They were conducting an internal investigation, but couldn't provide any details. They had removed the listing permanently. The host was banned from the platform. That was it. No legal action, no real consequences. I felt my stomach drop. He got away with it. A week later, I finally got a call from the police. It wasn't what I wanted to hear. They had nothing. The Airbnb account was linked to a fake identity, prepaid phone numbers, and an untraceable bank account. Whoever he was, he had planned this carefully. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trail. It was like he never existed. They promised to keep the case open, but I could hear it in their voices. This was over for them. Not for me. I tried to move on. I deleted the Airbnb app, blocked their emails. I stopped traveling altogether for a while. Even now, I triple-check every hotel room, every Airbnb my friends book. But the worst part, the part that still keeps me up at night, I never found out who he was, what he wanted, where he uploaded that footage, because someone, somewhere, has it. Maybe it's locked away on a hard drive. Maybe it's on the dark web, passed around by people I'll never meet. Maybe it's already been deleted. Or maybe, just maybe, it was never about the videos. Maybe he just wanted to watch me, in real time, and now that I left, maybe he's found someone else. I love my job. I've been here for 5 years, and I truly believe the work I do makes a difference in the community. Feeling like my time matters keeps me motivated. My organization isn't huge, but we have multiple locations. Until recently, I worked on the 6th floor of a downtown building we leased. From my office window, I could see the state government building across the street, rows of people at their desks, living their lives, just like me. The company had been dealing with budget cuts, though, and most of my coworkers were being transferred to our main office outside of town. The building itself had changed hands a few months ago, and as leases expired, entire floors emptied out. The layout of my floor was a large U-shape, with offices along the outer edges and a conference room and break room in the center. The elevators and bathrooms sat at the bend of the U. Most of the remaining staff worked on the opposite side, at least. They had before they were relocated. Now most days I was completely alone. At first, I enjoyed the silence. I could blast my music, work without distractions, and actually be productive. Then things started happening. And now, I don't want to go back. 3 days ago, I heard whistling. A soft, clear tune coming from the far end of the hallway. I thought someone must have come in without signing the digital check-in tablet, but when I stepped outside my office, the hallway was empty. The lights flickered. The air shifted, like when you walk into a room where people were just talking about you. That thick, charged silence, waiting for you to react. I grabbed my bag and left early. That night, I texted a coworker who had already been transferred to the main office. He responded immediately, confused. He said he hadn't been relocated yet. I asked what he meant, but he never replied. The next morning, I called another colleague from my floor. His phone rang down the hall. It rang until someone or something picked up. I heard the call connect, but there was no voice, no sound. Nothing. My stomach twisted. Had I misunderstood? Maybe my coworkers weren't at the new office. Maybe they were just working from home. But that feeling didn't go away. It felt like I was missing something. Later that afternoon, the whistling returned. This time, it was closer. I sat at my desk, frozen, listening as it moved not randomly, but deliberately. like someone was pacing. Then my office door creaked open. I hadn't touched it. The air inside my office felt different, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. That's when I saw him, the man in the government building across the street. He stood at his window, hands pressed against the glass. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear. At first, I thought he was staring at me. Then he lifted a hand and pointed. Not at my office. Behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. When I turned back, the man was gone. I grabbed my things and left without looking back. This morning, I told myself I had imagined everything. That nothing strange had happened, that it was just stress. But when I arrived, the parking lot was empty. Fresh snow coated the ground, untouched by footprints or tire tracks. I tried calling building security. The line was disconnected. I took the stairs to the main lobby. Empty. No receptionist, no guards, no one. When I returned to my floor, my office door was wide open. Papers were scattered across my desk. The computer screen flickered, then shut off. And then, the whistling came again. But this time, it wasn't slow or lazy. It was moving, fast, running, toward me. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway lights buzzed and popped, plunging the floor into half-darkness. I grabbed my bag and ran for the elevator. The whistling grew louder. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but I felt it. Something was inches behind me. The elevator doors slid open. I threw myself inside, jamming the ground floor button. The whistling stopped right outside the doors. And then, a shadow moved. For a split second it was there. A hand. Reaching. Trying to stop the doors from closing. They slammed shut just before it could. I didn't breathe again until I was outside. I drove straight to the main office, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. The sight of peepactual, real people going about their day nearly broke me. I ran inside straight to HR. They blinked at me when I asked about my team. There was no record of them transferring. No one knew where they were. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I texted with someone a few days ago." They checked again. "There's nothing here. No transfers. No relocation orders." As far as the company knew, my team was still working on the 6th floor. Except they weren't. They hadn't been there for days. And no one seemed to care. My boss barely glanced up from his meeting when I showed up. HR was more concerned with budget cuts than missing employees. But they still weren't ready for me at the main building. They told me to go back tomorrow. Like everything was fine. Like I hadn't just escaped from something I can't explain. I don't want to go back. I don't know who or what has been whistling in that building. I just know one thing. Tomorrow, I might not make it out again. I take the same subway to work every morning. Same train, same time, same seat, if I can get it. It's a routine I don't think much about, just a mindless part of my day. One that I go through without really seeing anyone around me. But yesterday, something changed. And now, I can't stop thinking about it. The train was crowded but quiet. Rush hour always packed the subway with a mix of office workers, students, and exhausted night shift employees heading home. I had managed to find a seat near the middle of the car, wedged between a woman scrolling through emails and an older man staring blankly at the floor. I had my headphones in, my usual playlist humming low in the background, but I wasn't really listening. I was just staring at my phone, flipping through news headlines, waiting for the ride to be over. That's when I felt it. Not a touch, not a sound. Just a feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it at first. People glance at each other all the time on the subway. It's normal. But the sensation wouldn't go away. It crawled up my spine, an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. Slowly, I looked up. There was a man sitting directly across from me, phone in hand. He looked normal enough, mid-30s, dark jacket, short, unkempt hair. But something about him felt off. It wasn't just that he was looking at me. It was how he was looking. Not casually, not like he had just happened to glance up from his screen. His eyes flicked between me and his phone, almost like he was checking something. I frowned, shifting in my seat, trying to shake the unease curling in my stomach. I was probably imagining things, reading too much into it. Then, in the dull reflection of the subway window behind him, I saw his screen, and my blood ran cold. It was a photo of me, not a live camera feed, not a reflection. A picture, a still image of my face, clear as day, taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I felt my chest tighten. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was a stock photo of someone who looked like me. But then, he swiped left. Another photo. Me again. Swipe. Another. And another. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. The pictures weren't just from today. Some of them were from weeks ago. Months. My heart slammed against my ribs. What the hell was I looking at? I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe through the sudden nausea threatening to rise in my throat. I needed to know for sure. I shifted slightly, pretending to adjust my bag, angling my head just enough to see his screen better. The next photo made my stomach drop. It was of me in my apartment. Not a selfie, not something I had taken. A photo of me sitting on my couch, in my pajamas. I stopped breathing. That picture wasn't on my phone. I knew for a fact I had never posted it, never sent it, never taken it. How did he have it? I sat frozen, my entire body locked in place. The subway rumbled along the tracks, rocking slightly as it carried us forward, but everything around me blurred into nothing. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I needed to move. I needed to say something. But what? My mouth felt dry. My fingers curled into my lap, blood draining from my knuckles. Then, before I could even process what I was doing, I spoke. "Where did you get those?" My own voice startled me. It came out hollow, quieter than I expected. The man's head snapped up. His expression barely changed, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of amusement, like he had been waiting for me to say something. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he smirked, a small, almost imperceptible curl of his lips. And then, without a word, he stood up. The train slowed. We were pulling into the next station. I turned in my seat, my pulse racing. He started walking toward the doors, completely unbothered, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. I should have followed him, should have demanded an answer, but my body wouldn't move. I just sat there, frozen in place, watching him leave. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. He stepped off onto the platform and disappeared into the crowd. Gone. I sat there for 3 more stops, my mind spinning, replaying everything. The photos, the way he looked at me, the fact that he didn't even try to hide it. Finally, I forced myself to move. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving before my brain could catch up. I opened my camera roll, scanned through my albums, checked my social media. Nothing. None of those pictures existed anywhere on my accounts. I went through every folder, every archive, even my cloud backups. Nothing. It didn't make sense. The only way he could have gotten that photo of me at home was if someone else had taken it, or if someone had access to my camera without me knowing. A sickening realization settled in my stomach. Had my phone been hacked? I switched off my Wi-Fi, disabled my Bluetooth, deleted every third-party app I didn't recognize. I wasn't even sure if it would help, but I was panicking, grasping at anything that made me feel like I had control. The train screeched to a stop at my station. I stepped off in a daze, checking over my shoulder instinctively. He was gone, but something told me this wasn't over. As I walked toward my apartment, my phone buzzed. A notification. An airdrop request. My breath hitched. The file name was just one word. Smile. I stared at the screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. The preview image was blurred, but I could still make out the shape of a face. My face. And I wasn't smiling. I didn't accept the airdrop. I couldn't. My fingers hovered over the screen, my breath shallow, heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. The file name, Smile. The preview image, my own face, blurred but unmistakable. I didn't know what to do. If I accepted it, I'd be letting this person, whoever they were, send something directly to my phone. But if I declined, then what? Would they just try again? I quickly looked around, scanning the crowd outside the subway station. No one seemed out of place. Dozens of people, all caught up in their own route and checking their phones, rushing to their next destination, oblivious to the fact that I was losing my mind. Was he still here? Watching? I clenched my phone, my stomach twisting. I knew airdrop requests only worked within a certain range. He had to be close. I glanced over my shoulder. A man in a navy hoodie leaned against the wall near the exit, staring at his phone. A woman with a stroller scrolled absent-mindedly while waiting for her ride. A group of teenagers laughed over something on their screens. Any one of them could have sent it. Or none of them. My phone buzzed again. The airdrop request timed out. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry, my skin crawling. Who was doing this? I rushed out of the station, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. My hands were still trembling as I unlocked my apartment door, practically slamming it shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to get my thoughts straight. Then, I opened my phone. I went straight to my airdrop settings. It was set to everyone. I didn't remember changing it to that. With shaking hands, I switched it to contacts only. Then, just to be safe, I turned off Bluetooth entirely. I needed to figure this out. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through every possible explanation. Was my phone hacked? I checked my privacy settings, my camera permissions, my app data. Nothing looked unusual. No unknown devices linked to my account, no strange apps running in the background. But then again, would I even know what to look for? I tried to be rational. Maybe it was a prank. Some random subway creep messing with me, sending airdrops to strangers just to freak them out. But that didn't explain the photos. The ones on his phone. The ones of me. How the hell did he have them? And then, another thought crept in I didn't want to consider. What if my apartment was compromised? That picture of me in my pajamas, someone had to have taken it. From inside my own home, I felt my stomach twist. I stood up, moving room by room, checking every inch of my apartment. I opened every closet, pushed aside the coats, checked under the bed, ran my fingers along the edges of my mirror, looking for anything off. I stared up at the smoke detector. My heart pounded in my chest. It was just a normal detector. No hidden lenses, no strange black dots like the ones I had read about online. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and pulled the smoke detector from the ceiling. My hands fumbled as I pried it open. Nothing. No wires, no cameras, just a regular battery-powered alarm. I let out a slow, shaky breath. I was losing it, but something in me wouldn't let it go. I checked the air vents, the shower head, the tiny gap between the fridge and the wall. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I knew what I was afraid of, and I was terrified that I'd find it. That night I was terrified. Every sound made my skin freeze. Every shadow seemed too dark, too deep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. For what, I wasn't sure. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, my phone was vibrating. A text. Unknown number. Check your email. A slow wave of dread rolled through me. I didn't want to check, but I did. My inbox had one new email. No subject line, no sender name. I hesitated before tapping it open. There was just one attachment. A video file. I exhaled sharply, my fingers icy as I tapped the screen. The video was dark at first. Then the image came into focus. My apartment. My bedroom. The angle was slightly tilted like a camera had been placed low to the ground, near the floor. The video was grainy, dimly lit by the glow of my bedside lamp. And then movement. My chest tightened. In the frame, I saw myself, lying in bed, asleep. My breath hitched. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from last night. A full-body shiver ran through me. Someone had recorded me in my own apartment. While I was sleeping, I felt a wave of nausea. The video kept playing. I wanted to turn it off, but I couldn't look away. Then, near the end, something changed. The camera angle shifted slightly, as if someone had picked it up. For the briefest moment, I saw movement near the bottom of the screen, a shape, a hand. And then, just before the video cut off, a face. Just a flicker of it. Too fast to fully process. But I saw enough. It was him. The man from the subway. He had been inside my apartment, watching me, recording me. My stomach lurched. I dropped my phone onto the table, stumbling backward, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. This was real. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't some stupid prank. He had been here. He had been in my home. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I dialed 911. The line rang once, twice. Then, before the dispatcher could even speak, I choked out the words, "There's someone watching me." The 911 dispatcher's voice came through the speaker, calm but firm. "What's your emergency?" I was shaking too hard to answer right away. My breath came out uneven, my mind still reeling from the video I had just watched. I swallowed, forcing myself to speak. "There's someone watching me. He was in my apartment." A pause. Then, is he still inside now? I glanced around, my pulse roaring in my ears. The apartment was silent, no footsteps, no movement, but I didn't trust it. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking slightly, "but I have proof he sent me a video of me from last night." Another pause. The dispatcher's voice remained steady. "I'm sending officers to your location now. Can you safely leave the apartment?" I wanted to. I wanted to run, to grab my keys and bolt, to never set foot in this place again. But I had checked everything earlier. The doors, the windows, the vents. There had been nothing. So how had he gotten in? I felt my stomach twist. If he had a way in, what if he was still here? I exhaled shakily, gripping my phone. "I'm leaving now." I grabbed my keys with trembling fingers and headed for the front door. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the lock. I had just turned the knob when the floor creaked. Right behind me. Every nerve in my body froze. I didn't turn around. I didn't breathe. The dispatcher was still on the line. I whispered, barely audible, "Someone's here." A sharp inhale from the other end. "Get out now." My entire body snapped into motion. The cold air hit me as I stumbled into the hallway, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't look back, I just ran. I only stopped once I was outside, standing under the streetlights, gasping for air. Then I heard the sirens. The cops didn't waste time. They swept the apartment, guns drawn. I stood outside, arms wrapped tightly around myself, my entire body still trembling. Minutes passed. Then one of the officers reappeared, shaking his head. Nobody's inside. I swallowed hard. There has to be. I heard him. The officer frowned but didn't dismiss me. They kept searching. Then something changed. One of them called from the bedroom. Found something. A surge of dread hit me as I followed them inside. My apartment looked the same, normal, like nothing had happened. But as I stepped into my bedroom, I saw where the officer was standing by my closet. The door was wide open. Inside, my clothes hung undisturbed. My shoes were neatly lined up against the wall. But the officer wasn't looking at my clothes. He was looking above them. At the ceiling panel, a small square attic access panel, one that had been shifted slightly out of place. I yanked the door open and sprinted. I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. I had never noticed it before. One of the officers grabbed a chair, standing on it, to push the panel open. The moment he did, a wave of cold, stale air drifted down. Then a rope ladder rolled up, hidden against the beams. Someone had been climbing up there. My entire body went numb. He had been in the ceiling, watching me, listening. One of the officers climbed up, flashlight in hand. I held my breath, barely aware that I was gripping my own arms so tightly my fingers were digging into my skin. Then his voice. Jesus, you're gonna want to see this. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. They helped me up the ladder, and as my head poked through the opening, my stomach lurched. It was a small crawl space. Not an actual attic, just a narrow stretch of beams and insulation. But there was enough room to lie down. And someone had. A thin mattress, a pile of food wrappers, empty water bottles. And the worst part? A notebook. I felt sick as one of the officers flipped it open. The pages were filled with dates, notes, times, my name. The officer turned a page, his jaw tightening. Then he showed it to me. My stomach dropped. It was a sketch of my bedroom. The bed, the closet, the exact position of my desk, my mirror, everything. And in the corner, drawn with painful detail, a tiny camera, tucked behind my bookshelf. My breath hitched. I spun around, staring at my bookshelf like it had just come alive. The officers moved fast. They pulled the bookshelf away from the wall. And there it was, a small black camera, perfectly hidden, perfectly placed, watching me every night. I thought I was going to be sick. One of the officers exhaled sharply. He's been here a while. I stared at the mattress in the attic, the wrappers, the notes. How long had he been living above me? 1 month? 2? Long enough to memorize my routines. Long enough to know exactly when I was asleep. I didn't go back to the apartment, not even to grab my things. The police took everything as evidence. The camera, the notebook, the rope ladder. But they never found him. Whoever he was gone. Vanished. Like he had never existed at all. They checked the security footage from my building, looking for someone entering or leaving. But there was nothing. No signs of forced entry. No records of anyone coming in that shouldn't have been there. It was like he had been inside the whole time. And then, a few days later, I got another email. No subject, no message. Just one attachment. A photo of me, sleeping, timestamp 2 nights ago. After I had already left, I changed everything. New number, new email. I moved across the city, got a new job, found an apartment with no attic, no crawl spaces, no vents big enough for anyone to hide in. And still, sometimes late at night I wake up feeling watched. I tell myself it's paranoia, that I'm safe, that he's gone. But deep down, I know the truth. He was never trying to hurt me. He was just watching. And maybe he still is.